Hey friends, it's Sarah. Like half the internet, I've been obsessed with the TV show Our Flag Means Death. If you haven't watched it, just go watch it right now and then come back here. But basically, this is a TV show about Blackbeard and the gentleman pirate Stede Bonnet. It's historical fiction with a lot of emphasis on the fiction part of it, and stars Taika Waititi and Rhys Darby in a hilarious high seas romp full of queer characters and surprisingly touching moments. When I say this show reignited my deep obsessive fandom habits, you really don't want to know what my Tumblr looks like right now. But watching this show made me super curious about pirates because they're sort of these like mythical beings, and most of what I know about them is based on media like Treasure Island and Pirates of the Caribbean. So, of course, I turned to books to fill in the gaps in my knowledge, and now here I am to share that knowledge with you. This is going to be the first part in a two-part series about pirates, and in this video I'm going to talk about the specifics of life as a pirate and what/how Our Flag Means Death incorporated into their show. The second video will focus more specifically on Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet's lives and have main reviews for each of the books. So buckle up and join me on the high seas. Couple of disclaimers before we get into it. First off, there will be spoilers for both seasons of Our Flag Means Death woven in through the majority of the video, so again, I would highly recommend that you go watch the show first before this video, but if not, you have been warned. Second, while I read a selection of different books for this video, a lot of them rely on the same primary sources because there are so few accounts available from the time of piracy. The most prominent work referenced is Captain Johnson's A General History of Pirates, which is based mostly on court documents and interviews with captured pirates. It's uncertain how much is fact and how much is more sensational or akin to a tabloid. Also, Captain Johnson is assumed to be a pen name, and some thought it was actually Daniel Defoe, who was the author of Robinson Crusoe, but no one knows his actual identity. Most of the books I read did try to back up different dates and events by cross-referencing other primary sources, but there is still a lot that is unverified. Another primary source was The Buccaneers of America by Alexandre Olivier Esquemelin, or John Esquemelin. There's a whole bunch of different spellings of his name, but it was originally published in Dutch in 1678, and the author was a barber surgeon on a pirate ship and had a great first-hand perspective on piracy. However, his account is from about 40 years before Blackbeard and Bonnet's time, so it's kind of less relevant for the purposes of this video. For this video, I read 6 books. The Pirate's Wife, The Remarkable True Story of Sarah Kidd by Daphne Palmer Geanacopoulos, Born to be Hanged, The Epic Story of the Gentlemen Pirates Who Raided the South Seas, Rescued a Princess, and Stole a Fortune by Keith Thomson, Enemy of All Mankind, A True Story of Piracy, Power, and History's First Global Manhunt by Stephen Johnson, Under the Black Flag, The Romance and the Reality of Life Among the Pirates by David Cordingly, Blackbeard, America's Most Notorious Pirate by Angus Konstam, and finally, The Life and Trials of the Gentleman Pirate, Major Stede Bonnet by Jeremy R. Moss. And again, reviews for those books will be in my second video. So the golden age of piracy occurred from 1697 to 1726, which was the year in which the last mass hanging of pirates took place. The actual peak of pirate activity was from when the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1713 to 1722, when Black Bart's crew was hanged. In colonial America, the worst of it was from 1716 to 1720, when the Bahamas were turned into a pirate stronghold. And Our Flag Means Death plays around with these timelines to get famous pirates into the show when they wouldn't really have been contemporaries. For example, in season 2, the crew of the Revenge run into Ned Low, who was actually pirating after 1722, some 3 years after both Blackbeard and Bonnet had died. Calico Jack was active around the same time as Blackbeard and Bonnet, but actually hung around with like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who make an appearance in the show as well. Before we get too deep into the realities of pirate life, I wanted to debunk a couple of misconceptions spread by kind of historical and modern media that I definitely thought were true. So in terms of fashion, the knee-high boots that are often shown in pop culture came from the movies, and pirates also usually wore like kerchiefs or hats with long brims, kind of similar to baseball caps, that provided shade and kept long hair out of their face. Pirates didn't really have colorful tattoos, although some had drawings in dye, which was often gunpowder and spit, deposited under the skin using knives or sail needles. There's only one account of anyone walking the plank, which is actually attributed to Stede Bonnet, but that's pretty highly contested. That trope was popularized by fiction. Also, pirates rarely, if ever, buried their treasure, That was another myth from Treasure Island that was also perhaps inspired by Captain Kidd, who is said to have buried some of his treasure right before he was captured by the authorities and sentenced for piracy. X marks the spot was also invented in Treasure Island, and these last two myths actually pop up in Our Flag Means Death when Stede takes Lucius and Ed on a treasure hunt through the jungle in season 1. Although pirate media today shows the skull and crossbones as the only pirate flag, there was actually quite a variety. There were plain black flags, plain red flags, bleeding hearts, blazing balls, hourglasses, spears, cutlasses, and whole skeletons. The plain red flag was actually the most feared, as it meant the ship would give no quarter, meaning they would take no prisoners and show no mercy. Different pirates also had their own personal flags. So Blackbeard's flag showed a pirate standing on 2 skulls. One skull is labeled ABH, a Barbadian's head, and the other AMH, a Martinican's head, to reflect the pirates' feud with the authorities of these 2 islands. Calico Jack's flag was a skull, which is also called a death's head, over crossed cutlasses, so pretty similar to the Jolly Roger that we're familiar with today. In the past century, Blackbeard's flag has been described as a black flag with a skeleton holding an hourglass in one hand and a spear piercing a heart with 3 drops of blood in the other. This is the flag that's shown in season 2 of Our Flag Means Death after Blackbeard has gone rogue with heartbreak, but in the June 1718 issue of the Boston Newsletter, his flags are actually described as black flags and death's heads in them. So it's assuming that the skeleton flag is something that's been made up in the past 100 years. Our Flag Means Death took this idea of different pirates having different flags and had the crew make their own personal flags, which were very hilarious and not super piratey, but it was really fun. So kind of to give a bit of a historical context to this time period and setting, in the 1710s, the slave trade was incredibly lucrative. Slave ships could recoup the cost of the vessel in 1 or 2 trips, and this was even though the death toll on slave ships reached as high as 50% due to poor conditions, plus people jumping overboard rather than enduring the conditions or waiting for their fate once they arrived at their destination. And the average fatality rate was 1 in 5 or 20%, which is just horrifying that the most lucrative work that ships could have was trading in human beings. Not only did pirates trade in treasure and food, but they would also take slaves as goods to be traded or to use aboard their own ships. However, in late 1718, Blackbeard commanded a sloop, which is a type of ship, where almost half of the crew was of African descent. It's estimated that actually 25 to 30% of pirate crews were black, and mostly men who had escaped slavery. So half the crew being people of color on Our Flag Means Death is not that impossible or even improbable. So sometimes African slaves would run away from plantations or volunteer to join a crew if their ships were captured, and lots of Caribbean islands where pirates hung out had communities with mixed race people where a lot of runaway slaves lived. And often when pirate ships were captured, the African sailors would be treated like runaway slaves and be auctioned off, hence not appearing often in records even though they might have been part of the crew themselves. For example, Black Caesar, who is allegedly a former African chieftain who was Blackbeard's lieutenant on the Queen Anne's Revenge, he was below decks during Blackbeard's final fight, waiting for Blackbeard's order to blow up the ship, but was stopped by 2 prisoners who were in the hold of the ship. So that's an example of a well-known figure who was an African pirate. So in season 1 of Our Flag Means Death, when the Brits are aboard the Revenge, the non-white crew members are forced to act subservient to their white counterparts, with the pirates being portrayed as foils to the racist Europeans. Unfortunately, that's not strictly accurate. While pirates did tend to be more welcoming to people on the margins, like the previous examples mentioned, they weren't bastions of progress. Pirates had slaves. There were claims of escaped slaves joining pirate crews, but they also had just had a lot of enslaved people laboring on the ships. And when Captain Kidd was captured and tried for piracy, he was actually allowed to keep slaves with him while he awaited trial, which is really horrifying that a prisoner has more rights than a black person in this time period. In the early 18th century, being out on the sea offered one of the only chances for class mobility and accumulating wealth. So you can really see why this career path would be appealing to people born into the lower classes. However, conditions aboard ships could be pretty rough. Merchant captains had legal authority over their crews in the same way a parent had authority over their child or a master over their apprentice. Pirates were often sailors who were rebelling against the cruel treatment of merchant captains. For example, wage regulation for seamen was only introduced in 1726, but pirates worked on commission, called on account, and their shares of the treasure were evenly divided between each member of the crew. Another option between those two was called privateering, which was really just sanctioned piracy. Captains would get a letter of marque from their country's government, which allowed them to attack ships of enemy countries. And once they had captured a ship and brought it back to their home country, the loot would be sold at auction and they would be paid from those profits. The country issuing the letter of marque would also get a portion of the profits, so it was kind of a win-win for both sides, except for the people who got looted. Our Flag Means Death takes place primarily somewhere on the ocean, but real pirate hangouts were mostly centered around shipping lanes. So for example, the Bahamas were a popular spot to intercept Spanish ships returning from Central America, and the Republic of Pirates, which was featured in Our Flag Means Death, was actually in Nassau in the Bahamas. Madagascar was right in the path of ships trading with India, and Port Royal in Jamaica was called the Sodom of the New World and the wickedest city on earth. It sat along the shipping route between Spain and the New World and was said to have more brothels and bars than any other port in the Americas. Pirates could spend 2,000 to 3,000 pieces of 8 a night, which is $46,000 to $69,000 in today's money, and Tortuga, like from Pirates of the Caribbean, was actually a pirate safe haven on Hispaniola, which is the island that is now split into Haiti and the Dominican Republic. While pirates were constantly being hunted by privateers sanctioned by governments, they were also really good for the economy. They would sell exotic luxuries at a good price to merchants who could then sell them for a considerable markup, like up to 400% more. So you can see why some places would really welcome a pirate presence to boost their economy. So a lot of pirate media, of course, focuses on the battles and the looting done by pirates, but I was curious, what was life actually like aboard pirate ships? There aren't a ton of super detailed accounts of pirate life, so a lot of it's kind of unknown, like the specific day-to-day, but it was surprisingly organized for bands of ruffians. Pirate life was similar to life on merchant ships, as most pirates were former merchant seamen. However, pirate ships tended to have a lot more crew members. So for a merchant ship of 100 tons, there'd be about a 12-man crew, and for a pirate ship of the same size, it would have a crew of 80 or more. Also, the majority of pirates were in their late 20s, about 60% were in their 20s, some were a little bit younger, and the rest were in their 30s and 40s. This was a similar age range to any sailing crew at the time, so having a crew that was majority in their 30s or older, like in Our Flag Means Death, isn't really accurate, though I think if they had gone for historical accuracy, it would have really changed the whole vibe of the show, and it would have felt like a fraternity on the water. Which maybe that's what it was like, who knows. But pirate ships had fewer boys than other vessels because they were considered unsuited to pirate life, and most pirates had already had a sort of apprenticeship at sea and turned to piracy of their own free will. Few pirates were married, and women were often forbidden on pirate ships because it was believed that they would distract the crew. In fact, there were only 5 recorded female pirates, and 2 of these were Bonnet and Mary Read, who I mentioned previously, and who make an appearance in Our Flag Means Death. Though there are no sources saying that they were romantically involved, Bonnet was actually romantically involved with Calico Jack, but they both disguised themselves as men, and Anne had a little bit of a thing for Mary before realizing that she was also a woman in disguise. At the height of piracy from 1719 to 1722, there were between 1,800 and 2,400 active pirates, and in total from 1716 to 1726, there were around 4,000 pirates. And this is a time when the world population was 600 to 900 million people. The thing that really surprised me the most when doing this research was that pirate ships were democracies. Everyone got an equal vote on matters like who was captain, where to sail to, and whether to attack a ship. In addition to voting on big decisions, all crew members signed a set of written articles before departure that acted as rules for the ship. They covered everything from compensation for injury, punishments, curfews, and division of plunder, and they differed from ship to ship but usually covered the same ground. A set of articles from the crew of Bartholomew Roberts, who is Black Bart, includes 11 articles. Boiled down to their essence, they say everyone gets a fair share of the loot, don't steal, no gambling allowed, lights out at 8 p.m., keep weapons ready for battle, no boys or women on the ship, no deserting in battle, no fighting each other on the boat, plus rules on how to settle disputes on shore, injury compensation, how to divvy up the plunder, and musicians get a rest day on Sunday. Furthermore, some articles would lay out what could be taken as plunder. An example from Woodes Rogers' crew says, gold rings found in any place except in a goldsmith's shop is plunder. All arms, sea books and instruments, all clothing and movables usually worn about prisoners, and goes on for about 5 more lines. Each ship had two councils, one that decided where to get provisions for the trip, and a second that would draw up the code of conduct. So in addition to electing a captain, who was usually chosen due to his nautical knowledge, the crew would also elect a quartermaster who would dole out punishments, lead attacks on other ships, and kind of act as a general check on the captain so he didn't get out of line and go power crazy. The Pirate's Wife describes the quartermaster as part mediator, part treasurer, and part keeper of the peace. The quartermaster was also first in line to be captain if they captured a ship and turned it into a pirate vessel, and other specialty jobs aboard the ship included boatswain, gunner, carpenter, cook, first mate, and second mate. There are also musicians aboard, presumably to help keep spirits afloat, and ships operated on a no-prey, no-pay system, so crews weren't paid a salary but would receive a share of whatever loot they captured, and when splitting up the treasure, it was slightly uneven, so the captain would get 5 or 6 shares of the loot, a carpenter would receive 100 to 150 pieces of 8, and a surgeon would get 100 to 250 pieces of 8. Some money would then be set aside as compensation for injuries, so 600 pieces of 8 for losing a right arm, 500 pieces of 8 for a left arm or right leg, 400 for a left leg, and 100 for an eye or a finger. If this was also true in Our Flag Means Death, Izzy would have gotten 400 pieces of 8 for losing his leg in Season 2, and Lucius would have received 100 pieces of 8 for losing his finger in Season 1. But after all of that, each crew member would get 1 share of the remaining treasure. In addition to getting more money than the rest of the crew, the captain got the great cabin on the ship. However, other crew members could come in and out as they pleased, and even use his crockery. In Our Flag Means Death, we see this where various members of the crew pop in and out of Stede's cabin with no notice, from Season 1 with Olu sleeping on the couch and Lucius barging in to rescue Stede from his obsession with watching Ed and Calico Jack, to Izzy in Season 2 hanging out behind Stede's desk, or barging in on Ed and Stede the morning after. The show did a really good job of showing how the captain's cabin wasn't really a sacred or even private space. Stede was still the one who spent the most time in the cabin, but the crew felt comfortable coming and going as they pleased. Pirate captains ate the same food and dined with their crew, and crucially could be voted out by their crew. So this meant that pirate captains were really incentivized to listen to their crew and not get on their bad side lest they be cast out. One of the more time-consuming tasks in a pirate's life was boat maintenance. Every few months, boats had to be careened in order to make repairs and clean seaweed deposits and mollusks off the bottom of the ship. This process was also called heaving down, and it involved purposefully grounding a ship during high tide so you could make repairs to its hull when the water receded. In the Caribbean, it had to be done at least every 3 months, and in episode 2 of the first season of Our Flag Means Death, when they run aground, Stede really should have used that as an opportunity to make repairs to the ship instead of giving the crew a vacation, but that just goes to show his incompetence as a captain. Extra ships in the pirates' fleet could help with careening. They could use their wood to replace rotted wood or patch holes before tarring the outside of the ship with pitch. Pirates could also attach a top line to an adjacent vessel in order to tilt the mast of the ship they were working on. And if they didn't have a lot of time, pirates could also clean only the part of the ship's bottom that sits like just under the waterline. This was called boot topping and would still take several days, but was a lot quicker than careening. After a few weeks at sea, ships would often run out of fresh fruit and meats, and definitely not helped when someone, Stede, uses up all of the oranges to make a fancy cake. Staples like flowers and beans were difficult to store because of the wet, salty conditions on board ships. Fresh water would often develop algae and mold, and rum and wine held up better, so they were often favored as the drink of choice. Ships would mostly have food that could be kept for a long time, like pickled vegetables, salted meat, and dry biscuits. When plundering ships, pirates would also take food like turtles, chickens, pigs, birds, and fish, especially anchovies and pickled herring. Partly because of the abundance of alcohol on ships, pirates were often hammered. Blackbeard and Calico Jack were both overtaken by warships after a night of partying. Their crews were still recovering from the drink, aka we're all hungover as heck, and were taken by surprise. Sam Bellamy's Whydah crashed on the rocks when his crew was too drunk to react appropriately to a surprise storm. In fact, all seamen had bad drinking habits, so pirate captains and other sea captains would always have a hard time keeping enough rum aboard the ships. Rum kept the crew from becoming mutinous and restless, but is also a really great vehicle for getting the crew to consume limes to prevent scurvy. There's a supposed excerpt from Blackbeard's journal, which has since been lost, so I'm not sure how accurate this actually is, but it says, "Such a day, rum all out, our company somewhat sober, a damned confusion amongst us. Rogues applauding, great talk of separation. So I looked sharp for a prize. Such a day took one, with a great deal of liquor on board, so kept the company hot, damned hot, then all things went well again. Pirates also often had gambling problems. There's one example of pirates splitting 260,000 pieces of 8, which would be about $5.98 million today, and spending it within 3 weeks on gambling and other frivolities. Insane. Pirates were also notorious for sleeping around when at port, so of course, disease and STIs were rampant. Pirates were much more likely to die of disease than die in battle, and this being the late 1600s to early 1700s, healthcare was, to put it mildly, not very advanced compared to today. Syphilis was treated by injecting mercury into the urethra. This would have to be administered several times, sometimes over the course of several months. There was a popular saying at the time that went 2 minutes of Venus, 2 years with Mercury. Mercury causes salivation and urination, so they thought it would flush the system of syphilis. It didn't work. The only way it cured the disease was by killing the patient. The historical record doesn't have any mention of Stede Bonnet taking advantage of any liberties at port, but Blackbeard had a reputation of being a womanizer. He was described as having 13 wives, of marrying a young girl of 16, and of having at least one wife and child in London. There aren't any legal records to back any of this up, so it's not really clear if it's true or just a salacious rumor. The main storyline of Our Flag Means Death is really the relationship between Stede and Ed and the romance that blossoms between them. There weren't any mentions of homosexuality in pirate documents, and in Under the Black Flag, the author assumes this is either because there was no homosexual activity aboard pirate vessels, or that it was so commonplace and therefore not worth noting. I tend to lean towards the latter explanation because it seems pretty unbelievable that there would be no gay pirates at all. It's also possible that there was just a lack of documentation aboard pirate ships, so it was never recorded. Who knows? There was a practice called matelotage, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, which was a partnership between two pirates. This wasn't really necessarily romantic, and part of the agreement was often that the pirate who lived longer than the other would get all the other man's share of loot, or that the survivor would give part of that loot to the dead pirate's wife and or friends. I think this practice is actually the basis of Lucius and Blackbeard's marriage at the end of season 2, mostly because Roach declares them mateys at the end of the ceremony, and the vows also feature a lot of mentions of fighting and loyalty, which seems in line with the premise of matelotage, however that's pronounced. On the more cutthroat, bloodthirsty side of pirating were the actual lootings of other ships. In 72% of attacks, it was one single pirate ship versus one single merchant ship, but the most successful pirates would attack with 2 or more ships from their fleet. Sometimes pirate ships would disguise themselves by covering their gun ports with canvas, paint it to look like the hull of the ship, and merchant ships would paint fake gun ports on the side of their ships. However, when attacking, pirates didn't really feel the need to disguise their ships' identities when they were in pursuit of their prey, and they would fly their pirate flags and approach with guns firing. They would demand that the captain of the victim ship come to them to negotiate or possibly become a hostage. And usually pirates didn't hurt the merchant crews who surrendered immediately. Violence was used to quickly locate the goods or to maintain their terrifying image, so if the crews surrendered willingly, there wasn't much need for that. Pirates were also pretty big on revenge, so of course Jim from Our Flag Means Death really fits the bill there. Along with treasure, they would often steal skilled tradesmen like carpenters who repaired the ship or coopers who made the barrels in which to store food and drink, so it makes sense that at the end of season 1, Ed would keep Frenchie for his sewing skills and Jim for their knife-throwing abilities. They would also loot household goods to keep their own ship in good repair. Sometimes before battle, the carpenter would bolt or lash shut any non-essential cabins to prevent crewmen from hiding from battle. Pirate ship guns and cannons need between 4 and 6 men to fire each gun, so it makes sense that these pirate ships would have so many more crew members in order to take advantage of all of the guns on their ships, and you wouldn't want anyone hiding below decks. That would skew your chances of winning a fight. Accidental explosions of gunpowder accounted for 1/4 of all injuries and deaths during sea battles. And pirates would use early forms of grenades, so hollow iron or wood balls that would be filled with gunpowder with a fuse, which they would light and then throw or shoot out of a cannon. As previously mentioned, there was only one account of walking the plank and was attributed to Stede Bonnet, but the account is highly contested and walking the plank is assumed to be a fiction. Our Flag Means Death sticks with the rumor and has Stede force Ned Lowe to walk the plank in season 2, and is a really fun nod to the part of the Gentleman Pirates mythology. Pirates did engage in other very creative tortures, so the tortures that Ned Lowe and his crew enact on the crew of the Revenge were probably fairly close to some of the tortures common at the time. In Born to be Hanged, the author says, "Pirates made it their business to thoroughly question all prisoners about their hometowns, cities, and countries. Consequently, pirate ships were floating census bureaus with information on each area's manufacturing, wealth, fortifications, military strengths, and susceptibilities that would have rivaled the dossier compiled by any intelligence agency." On September 5th, 1717, King George I signed a proclamation for suppressing pirates to help end piracy. So pirates had a year to turn themselves in to a principal secretary of state in Great Britain or Ireland, and any governor or deputy governor of any of Great Britain's plantations. So if they did so, any acts of piracy they had committed before January 5th, 1718 would be forgiven. The proclamation also issued bounties for any pirates who didn't turn themselves in before the deadline. The bounty was as follows: £100 for a captain or commander, £40 for a lieutenant, master, boatswain, carpenter, or gunner, £30 for an inferior officer, or £20 for any other crew members. If a pirate turned in their captain and the captain was convicted for piracy, the crew member would get £200. Our Flag Means Death uses this act of grace near the end of season 1, but changes it up a little bit. They send Ed and Stede to a privateering academy, which wasn't a thing because privateering is just piracy on behalf of a country, and the only tangible difference was a document saying they were allowed to attack other country ships. However, both Blackbeard and Bonnet did turn themselves in, got a king's pardon, and became privateers, albeit at different times in their own careers. So while the show condensed the timeline and added a little bit of dramatic flair, this is actually based in fact. Pirates who were turned in and had to stand trial had a really bad time of it. When a pirate went to trial, they were basically signing up for the death penalty. They had to conduct their own defense in court because their crime was said to have injured the crown, so they didn't get a lawyer. And admission to watch a trial at the time actually cost more than admission to the theater, so this was a very popular pastime for all those landlubbers. Pirates were called hostes humani generis, pardon my Latin pronunciation, or enemies of the human race / all mankind. While that designation was originally only for pirates in order to fix the muddy legality of trying people for crimes committed in international waters, it eventually got extended to war criminals, torturers, and terrorists. Pirates rarely won their cases and were usually sentenced to hang. Their gallows were on the shore or riverside between the high and low tide marks, and they drew large crowds on shore and on boats. In London, the pirate would ride in a cart with a chaplain from the Marshalsea prison across the London Bridge to Wapping and Execution Dock, where he was given a chance to say his last words. Pirates were hanged with a shorter rope than usual, so their necks didn't break, and they asphyxiated to death instead. And it was not unusual for relatives or friends to pull on the pirate's legs to put him out of his agony. After being hanged, the body would be cut down and retied to a post where 3 tides would be allowed to pass over it. Then it was cut down again and either buried in an unmarked grave, sent to the surgeon's hall for dissection, or if it was a particularly famous pirate, suspended at the entrance of the harbor or waterway as a warning for others considering piracy. The bodies that were displayed were usually in a harness of iron and chains and coated in tar to preserve them. This didn't happen to Blackbeard or Bonnet, but Captain Kidd was one of the pirates whose corpse was displayed as a warning to others. So that about covers the general pirate life aspects, and this is already super long, so it's going to be 2 videos like I said at the beginning, and I will cover Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet's lives in the second video, so tune in 2 weeks to find out how similar the characters of Ed and Stede are to their real life counterparts. Thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time and in 2 weeks. Bartholomew. A couple of curved fruit, different pirates were barging in on Eden. There were plain black Geanacopoulos first signed. Oh fuck, where'd it go? In total between. Oh no, I've lost it. Totally popularized.